Um, yeah, we're just about ready. She needs to use the restroom and she'll be right back.
Okay, yeah. As soon as she gets back, we can probably start.
Okay. Yes, that's right.
Hi there. Does somebody mind doing a, say, testing or something so I can check my audio? Somebody do that?
Do what?
Oh, okay. There we go. I just needed somebody to speak so I could test my audio before we
Oh,
start.
okay. So, yeah.
So thank
Nope.
you.
You're good on our end too, so.
Yeah. All right.
I have students mark their favorite place,
Mm-hmm.
the star, and a happy.
Nobody wanted to go to Egypt? That's where I would go and go.
Really?
Should I mute my phone?
Hmm?
Turn my phone. Okay, are we ready?
I think this one here is where the video. Okay.
So this is yours over here. You can sit here. So I'm going to introduce myself now. I don't know what this enhanced did. Okay. So there's
So Casey, it's what the computer's doing is it's downloading an enhanced dictation.
Okay. You're talking really quiet. Are we going to use John's computer or your computer for the audio?
We could use.
We'll do a check. Can you hear me okay here?
Yeah, I can hear you okay there.
Okay. Right. Or,
I could maybe do from that one, and then I could read this one.
okay.
Okay.
You say yours.
Okay.
Because I can switch your audios. I have Lenore muted right now.
Yeah.
Okay. We're okay. Can you hear me okay now, Casey?
It's better. It's still pretty quiet though.
Oh, you can't hear me okay. So, is down or not? You have to leave the speakers. Okay. Can you hear me now, or is it still?
That's better.
Okay. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started then.
Okay.
Okay. Ni time ni nahaban a da siniki nanisahit ahak nakitha nagyatha bodaki Lenore Stiffarm naha sitima. I just said, hello, my relatives. How are you doing? My name is Woman Who Sits on the Rock, Woman Who Sits Among the Chiefs, Flying Woman, Lenore Stiffarm. That's what they call me. So John, come introduce yourself. Come and introduce yourself.
Hey, neat time. And he said, hey, was John Stiffarm that had said, no. Ninano, he thought to me, but he ate down with no hole. And he thought, and that's what done the ho. Gathene gets neat time that the not staying that if you want that on and he thought, not spawn that fake your hot school with the what then that neat time don't on that that's non heat that Fort Belknap Preservation. Good to my first time here on a setup like this, and we're just trying to get situated here and hopefully everything worked out good. It's informative for all today.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and I guess play. So I'm going to set up the where is it? Okay, I want to start the.
All right, Lenore, you want to go to your slideshow tab at the top?
Okay, I got it. So I go to view.
No, or two to the left. It's going to say slideshow right at the top. So keep going.
Got it. Okay, so play.
So it's home. There we go. So you're good.
Okay, great. We did our introductions. And about the authors. We're both from Fort Belknap. And Casey was kind enough to put a nice map on here for us to show where we presently are today with the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. And I just wanted to share a little bit about the background of who we are as Ani people. The colonized name, of course, is Grovon. And we took treaty with the Blackfeet on October 17th of 1855. And I kind of put a little part of the introduction into this because I feel it's important to see how all of this came about, that all of this was made and concluded at the Upper Missouri near the mouth of the Judith River in the territory of Nebraska. This was obviously before we had a state of Montana. And this was made on October 17th of 1855, and that's what we refer to as the 1855 Treaty. Now, this was put together by Cumming and Stevens, who were commissioners, and it states in the treaty that these were duly appointed and authorized on behalf of the United States. They also include a number of undersigned chiefs and headmen and delegates who were authorized to come and discuss this, and who also occupy the hunting in the territory of the Upper Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. So if you kind of get a sense, I showed you the map of Fort Belknap, where our hunting ground came from sort of the Rocky Mountain front there all the way over to about North Dakota, up through into Canada and down to the Yellowstone River. And these are really, really critical hunting grounds because they serve a lot of who we are and where we are today. In there, they included a number of tribal nations: the Blackfeet, the Piegan, the Kainai, or the Blood that they call them here, the Blackfoot, which is the Siksika, as well as our tribe, our colonized name of the Gros Ventre tribe. And so then west of the Rocky Mountain, they also included the Flathead, the Upper Pend d'Oreille, the Kootenai, and the Nez Perce tribes, and they were on the western side of the Rocky Mountain. I offer this information as a background and a context of how all of this has where we were in the beginning and what has happened, and how we ended up on this small little piece of land, and how we talk about in the article the whole notion of historical trauma. Also tied in with that is the genocide. You know, the foreigners came here, and basically they wanted our land, they wanted our assets. They illegally set up legal instruments with which to take this information. And of course, this has impacted because of us having a different worldview than other people. What has happened is we had a different sense of signing and what this meant, that we were going to share the land, because many, many years ago, of course, our people said nobody really owned the land, that we were caretakers of the land. And then there was these foreign groups that came in and made treaties to take our land from us. So, of course, this creates a lot of confusion for the people with which there was this clashing of worldviews about understanding what all of this meant. This, of course, resulted in, because this whole discussion and the language, and in each of the presentations that people have talked about, each of our previous presenters have pointed out that what has happened is there has been historic trauma. There needs to be healing. There needs to be sort of a sense of coming to peace with all that has happened to our people. And I talk in the article about the absolute trauma that my father experienced, having the language beat out of him. When he was herded in, he didn't understand where they were going. He and his brothers and his sister were herded into this Catholic school. They had long hair, their hair was cut off. This delicing stuff was put on them. And so his brothers and sister were crying, and he tried to comfort them in the Ani language. And the nuns put his hand down and they beat his fingers with rulers. After they beat his fingers with rulers, he realized he should not speak the language. And of course, then he tried to speak in our universal sign language, and they beat him again. So his whole life, his hands were deformed. And his hands were deformed. And then in the 70s, there was a move, then another federal policy that came by and said, oh my gosh, what have we done to these folks? We better bring their ways back to them. So they come to my father and they tell him, we're going to give you $100. We want you to come into the schools and teach the children the language. Well, my father left the tobacco on the table, and I came by to see him, and he said, you know, and he referred to all the Christians and everything as the white man. That was his generic term. He said, you know, the white man's really crazy. He said, look, he said, they beat the language out of me. He said, well, that wasn't that long ago. He said, within the past 50 years. He said, now, he said, white man is hawkats, meaning he's crazy. He said, now he wants me to come back and he's going to pay me $100 a day to come and teach my grandchildren how to speak the language. And he said, I must go and pray about this. He said, because he's kind of crazy. Who's to say in another 50 years he might make another law where he's going to beat up my grandchildren? So that posed a real dilemma. It's posed an incredible amount of challenges for our community right here at Fort Belknap. We have this thing called historic trauma, and people have said, well, what is it? And it's been related, it comes from the term social work, to look at genocide, slavery, forced relocation, the destruction of our ways of knowing and being, and the language revitalization is part of that. And so these are the experiences shared by numerous communities that have resulted in lots of emotional, psychological, physical, spiritual wounds that we've carried across generations. And that, and so this is what is called historical trauma. Of course, the effects of this trauma that has been inflicted is still evident in today's society with numerous parts of our community. You know, we have the largest suicide rate in the state of Montana here at Fort Belknap. We have a huge social service department where the children are being placed in numerous homes. They can't even find the number of homes. We have a massive meth and alcohol and substance abuse problem. We have a prescription drug problem. And to me, we have abandonment. A lot of the families don't know how to relate to the children in a positive format, because when our people were pulled away, they were pulled away and they became institutionalized. We have the largest number of people in the prisons here in Montana. And so how do we begin to make sense of this? You know, it's not something that we can push under the rug and put away, because it is still happening today. And so this is part of the historic trauma, and I just found this and I thought this is perfect. It shows today, not even in 1958, this letter showed about this letter that came, and they wanted to give these little children for $10 to do with what you would desire to. To me, this is, you know, part of the sex trafficking, the human trafficking that has occurred. And this comes from the Tikawitha Indian Mission in Sisseton, South Dakota. So the pain, what we have to look at, I feel, as Indigenous people, as Ani people, is to look at it, to deal with it, and to not get stuck in the pain, but to find resolution, to grieve and to heal and to move forward in a way that is going to rebuild our communities. And here's a picture of the students at the Fort Belknap boarding school where our children were herded in and just taken to these schools. There's a picture here of the people who were at a celebration, doing a dance, if you will. Today they call them powwows. And then I wanted to show a picture of some of the beadwork of our people that really illustrates, you know, the horse and you know, it tells a story. It's another way of how we keep our history. So I wanted to give a couple of examples of the clashing worldviews, and I really I have a late teacher who I just admire so much. His name was George Goodstriker, and he had such a rich way of illustrating the clashing of worldviews. And the story that he would tell, which I love to share, is the story about how some of our people were put in jail one time, and they, you know, because of this historic trauma, of course, our people were very frightened of authority. And they were put in jail, and they were coming out before the judge the next day. And so the judge told this one man, he said, he slammed his gavel down, and he said, I want you to tell me where you are from. So this native man was very nervous, and, you know, he didn't know what to say, so he knew he had to be honest. So he told the judge, he said, I want you to know, he said, I come from the trees, I come from the grass, I come from the coulees, I come from the hills, I come from the mountains, I come from the plains. And the judge slammed his gavel down really sternly and said, next, he said, I want you to tell me where you come from in 3 words. And so this native guy was very, very nervous, because he knew that his colleague had angered the judge. And so he shuffled back and forth, had his hands, put his hands together, rubbed his hands together, kind of rubbed his face, and kind of looked at his colleague, looked back around, and he just was very quiet. And he said, I'm his neighbor. So to me, this illustrates what happens with the clashing of worldviews. They have a total different idea about what goes on. And this goes back, of course, then to the whole notion of how a lot of our people think in terms of holistic terms, like when we think, for example, of Bitawu, Mother Earth, we don't just think of Mother Earth in isolation. We think of Bitawu, Mother Earth, in a whole circle. It's a whole galaxy. It includes the stars, you know, the sun, the moon. It includes all of life. It includes the water, the rocks, the air, everything. And it's also includes the family and the life givers, the women who are the life givers. So how the clashing worldview then is very, 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 very different than the Western worldview. One time I was teaching in Saskatchewan, and I was working with some Western scientists, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to incorporate Indigenous science into the classroom. And they said, well, I mean, what in the world would these people want? I mean, how in the world can you bring life to a rock? There is no life in a rock. And I said, oh my gosh, I was like shocked. It took my breath away. And I said, well, to me, there's a real richness in the rock, because the rock is our oldest spirit. It holds the heat, it heals us. And I went on, and the rock visits with us. So another clash of worldviews. Well, I could go on giving illustrations like this, but I think that'll kind of show a couple of illustrations. John, did you want to add anything? Go ahead. If you feel like you can come in, and then I'll continue. Okay. Okay. So John is going to speak to some of this right now.
Yeah, this is really neat setup, and I'm new to it. We're in our classroom right now. Like I said in my introduction, I'm a teacher here at the Harlem School in north central Montana. This is 3 miles off of the Fort Belknap Reservation. 98% of the student population is from the Fort Belknap Reservation. So that's the main population that we serve here. What I mentioned in my introduction is that I've been teaching here since 2007. And I was going to school over at University of Montana, Salish Kootenai College, and I took a break for 1 year to come back home and work, and then I was going back. Well, in that time, I was asked to come and teach the language and our history here to the students at Harlem School, and they said they're in need of a teacher, but they're looking for a long-term commitment. And so I thought about it. I thought about it for about 2 weeks, and then gave my answer and said, yeah, it's something I would want to do. And so loved it ever since, you know. Thought, yeah, I should have did this sooner. In the late 90s, they were wanting me to start teaching, and at that time I thought, no, I don't want to be a teacher. But I'm glad I made that choice, you know, and started this teaching. What I teach is our Ahani language, the culture. So with that, the history, the traditions, the songs, the dance, the values, and those are the things that I try to pass on to the students here at the Harlem School. The grades that I teach, this is a Class B school. So I don't know if you're familiar with the high school, how it's set up. The big schools, like in the city, in Billings and Great Falls, Helena, Missoula, those are AA schools. The next level down from that to us are the big schools, like Class A is the Havre, Browning, Lewistown, those are Class A schools. Then the next level down is Class B schools. And so that's Harlem, and schools such as Rocky Boy, Wolf Point, Poplar. And then the next level after that is Class C schools. And so that's the lowest student population. And so like Hayes Lodge, Cole, Fraser, you know, schools such as that. So we're in a Class B school. The student population is increasing. For the past 3 years, we've had, I was kind of gated on those kindergarten classes. We've always had 3 classes per grade level. So the past 3 years, they added an extra class for kindergarten. So there's 4 kindergarten classes, 4 first grade classes, and it looks like that trend is going to continue. So the grades that I teach here in a Class B school are kindergarten through 12th grade. I teach district-wide. And I've been trying to kind of get a feel for things here. I just came from the MIEA conference in Billings, Montana Indian Education Association conference. And I like going there because there's other teachers from other reservations there. And it's good that we can get together and share. And I took in a presentation from Northern Cheyenne Lame Deer School there. It was really good to see what they're doing in their schools there. But in the past, I don't know, 5, maybe 6 years, I've been trying to look out there for another person in the Class B school that teaches kindergarten through 12th grade. And so far, I've been the only one. It's unfortunate in the past 2 years, I'm trying to get them to hire on more teachers. And it's been difficult. And I should say there's some dynamics there, which I hope that we can address as a community and as a school, so that the language and the culture programs here at the school can grow. It's a challenge teaching kindergarten through 12th grade. In the mornings, I'm up here at the high school, so I teach junior high and high school classes in the morning, 11:30 to 12:10, excuse me, 11:35 to 12:10. I have a lunch break and I have to get down to the grade school across town. And then that afternoon starts right away with kindergarten. And I have 30-minute class sections there: kindergarten, 4th grade, 1st grade, 3rd grade, 2nd grade, and 6th grade. The only grade I don't get to is 5th grade, and that's because of time. I don't have enough time. It's a challenge, and it's something that needs to be done. There's a lot of things that could be done, and I hope to be doing here in the school districts. if the situation can change, that more teachers can be brought on, so on and so forth. So anyways, with the what she was mentioning in the PowerPoint about the treaty and about the mission school and about some of the photographs, those are things that I speak about in the introduction of my classes at the beginning of the school year, because that's the reason I have a job today. That's the reason why I'm in the schools, is because of the work of the mission school. Now here in this area, Fort Belknap Reservation area, this is their unique history is that before the reservation was established, the reservation was established in May of 1888, but the seal on our flag says 1889, probably because of everything being ratified by Congress and so on and so forth. But before that time, in 1887, there was a church and a mission built in what is now known as the town of Hayes on the south end of the Fort Belknap Reservation. In 1887, before the reservation was even established, there was a church built. Now, that area, which is now known as Hayes, and in the following years, which was the allotment period of when they started allotting land to the tribal enrolled members, the area which became known as Gros-Ventre area was the Hayes area. And so it really has some interesting dynamics, when we speak about our language and culture, and we'll talk about that later. The mission school, the mission, the Catholic Church, now we find it very interesting that it's been multiple generations now that it's become tradition, that there is baptism, that there's First Communion and confirmation, and that's been generations. And so it's almost that has become a part of the culture and replaces a lot of the I don't know if you want to call it the rites of passage, for an individual, such as getting a name. A lot of people will put more emphasis on getting baptized, getting their child baptized, than they would them receiving their ceremonial name, which will be later on. Oh, later on, I was meant to do that, they'd say, nah, they're teenagers and they're worried about getting a name for them. So there's been a shift in the values, there's been a shift in the priorities, and definitely, I love our Catholic people, I love Catholic faith, but what has happened to our people on and then here on this reservation, they've had a negative impact, which we're still trying to work through today. So they're the reason why I got a job, because the language has been encouraged less, and not until recent times, probably to the 1990s, that there's been a resurgence and interest in people to learn the language and to speak the language and to teach the language, preserve the language, and it's grown through the years. But before that, it wasn't a priority at all. And what was a priority? Ranching, cowboy, rodeo, hunting, of course, and things such as that, and those are all wonderful things, but what makes us who we are? And that's something that we speak of, that the language is what makes us who we are. We looked at some of the beadwork and some of the designs and the pictures. That was from, I believe it was 1906. It was 4th of July, 1906. And in that time period, it was allowed on what we call Beneath Fast Pitdanis, the summer big holy day, which is the 4th of July, that we were allowed to have all our ceremonies. Geez, it's almost like for that one day, we're allowed to be Indian. We were granted that permission from the Indian agent. And that's when, I don't know if it had kind of multiple reasons why that happened, but a lot of pictures were taken at that time. So a lot of pictures were taken with pipes and with headdresses by the Indigenous family. And so I think it might have been for some reasons, maybe to kind of display, to put the Indians on display for the Indigenous family, which came to visit. And so those are in the photos as well. So during that time, they had everything from a mock battle. They had Indian games or Indian games. They had hand games. They had stick games. They had a Sundance. And so it just was all allowed at that moment in time. They also had what some tribes call a kettle dance, which is the predecessor to modern day powwow. There's a lot of photos of that. And so, you know, it's really good photos, you know, really informative, you know, but it just always makes me question, why did the Indian allow that to happen? So it just kind of, you know, helps you to look into the whys and the reasons for that day. So some of the things that are philosophy and foundation for me in my teaching, not only teaching kindergarten through 12th grade, but also teach community classes, evening community classes. And the foundations for that is in the school here, but always is a reminder to me as a teacher is that as I look at these students, whether they're a senior in high school or a kindergartner, is I say, this is someone's baby. And I go from there. How would I want my baby being treated? You know, a lot of, you'll hear some cussing, you'll hear people telling each other, shut up, you know, and I have to remind them, no, you don't have to say that. It was just in this classroom today that with the eighth graders that I had to about 4 or 5 times remind them. Now, with these students, I've been with them since they were in 1st grade, and I looked at them and I said, you know, what have I done to disrespect you? And they looked at me surprised, and they shook their heads, no, nothing. I said, why are you disrespecting me in my classroom here? What did I do? I must have done something to anger you, to upset you, for you to use those words and to act that way in front of me in my classroom. And he just kind of looked like that, and they really started thinking. I said, how is it that you treat someone when they're good to you? And they spoke up. They said, you treat them good back. I said, well, this whole class I've been speaking to you with respect. I don't want to yell at you. That's the worst thing I can do is to yell at you. I always speak to you with respect. And then I hear you speaking to each other in that way in front of me. That makes me feel bad. They put their heads down and they understood. And that was been my philosophy all throughout. You know, they might not get that way of talking at home. Maybe they get yelled at. Maybe they just cuss filthy to one another as a family, parents to kids, kids to parents, and acceptable in the way it is. But when they come here into this classroom, when they come here, they're going to be spoken to with respect. They're going to be modeled that. I want to show them how one of the words that I used in my introduction, I said, "Hithahatsunehi," which is the word we use for a teacher, but really what it means is a shower. It's like someone that shows you how. And that's what I try to do, is show them how. Okay, we're going to learn some words, we're going to learn some phrases. I'm going to show them how it's said. I'm going to show them how they should be listening to that. Whether it's how we carry ourselves in life. Okay, maybe they don't know what respect looks like. Maybe they don't know what respect sounds like. I'm going to show them as the one that shows them. And so that's kind of foundations for me as a teacher. And what I try to go on in ways of teaching and learning is always go back to our teachings. So our teachings in our Indian way within our culture, very simple, but at the same time, they're just full of meaning. Ways, natural ways that which we have learned in the past. They talk about it and they call it the oral tradition. Well, we hear it in movies, we see it in books, but they never go into detail what it is. Break it down, explain it. How do we do it? Why do we do it? When do we do it? All those questions. At least I haven't heard it. And so in going with that, the oral tradition, there's some things there of learning that we strive to become well-spoken. Okay, well-spoken in our language so that we can express our thoughts and our feelings effectively. When we speak, it's hard to follow someone when they're stammering around. Wait, hold on. There's that one time. Oh no, wait, there's another one. They're like that. Okay, we strive to become well-spoken. Okay, and that's a process, lifelong process, but that's what we strive for. The way when we're speaking, the way that we learn is through listening. And that's something that we've forgotten how to do. We've forgotten how to listen. That's a whole art and skill and science in itself. And it takes a lot of practice, learning and relearning how to listen. How is that going to benefit us in life today, in today's world? Well, I give the example. When I was going to university, and as long as I made the lectures, I was okay. Yeah, I went about 2-3 years in the university, then I had to start doing other things. But as long as I made those lectures, because that's how I learned, was through listening. And so becoming active listeners, relearning how to listen, that's really important. Imagine having to learn complete ceremonies which span the period of 6 months, which are full of protocol and teaching within the protocol, without it being recorded video or audio recording, without it being written down, just through one person speaking to a student. That's what we try to get to for our children, because that's how we've learned in the past for thousands of years. Another way that we learned is through doing. I just have a neighbor, young man, and he's a former student here, and he's a singer, and he wants to learn about making drums. So he invited me over, and he had all the materials ready to go, and so I explained it to him, and he didn't truly start learning it until he did it, till he actually did it on his own. This is how we learn. You have to do it. You have to do it. Just throw yourself into it and do it, because when you do something, especially the first time, you're going to make mistakes. And with the mistakes, those aren't bad things. Mistakes are how we learn. We learn from our mistakes so that in the future, we don't repeat them, or if we do repeat them, it's not to the extreme that we did the first time. So those are natural ways of learning: speaking, listening, doing, and learning from our mistakes. It's always the challenge with Class 7 teachers, with people teaching language, especially our Indian languages, because it was spoken, it is spoken. Nowadays, there's been a big push amongst linguists and anthropologists and ethnologists to record our languages and to develop written forms of our language. And the goal is to make it more helpful for people to learn the language. Well, there's that debate. How much should we rely on written forms of our language? Do we want our students to become efficient, proficient in reading and writing the language? Or do we want them speaking the language? Now, within this system which I work, it's reinforced. If I produce lesson plans and I produce curriculum maps and I produce textbooks and workbooks full of worksheets, I'm seen as being an effective educator. I'm rewarded for that. Wow, good job. But then, how do I gauge my effectiveness as a teacher? Very simple. How many of my students are speaking the language? Okay, well, I'm not very effective then. Then you go back and you redo everything. And I found that I had to do that yearly. As students come and go, I have to redo things. It's not just as easy as Rosetta Stone. It's just not as easy as all these programs that are out there, because one thing is missing, and that's the teachings that are interwoven and interlaced throughout all our language, even words, groups of words and phrases, and when we use them, how we say them, the tone in which we say them. Those are the things that we need to teach. How do we teach? And so that's what it gets down to. It's as simple and as difficult as this. Just speaking it. It's what we teach and how we teach it. That's how this language, teaching the language goes. And I always encourage younger teachers that are coming up. There's a saying about inventing the wheel, reinventing. Oh, don't reinvent the wheel. Here's all this curriculum that's been developed already. Now look at them. I said, please reinvent the wheel. Please, I want to see your creativity, your innovation, because if it was already made, then our languages would be being saved. There would be that one way which all Indian tribes would be gravitating towards and say, hey, this is what works. This has been working. But there is no such thing yet. We need to keep striving and working towards that. And so those are some of the thoughts, that I'm bringing, to this. I don't know how this PowerPoint works. It's been on the same slide. I've just been talking the whole time.
Wait, I can move this.
Just been looking at.
That's this was
Okay.
This was Taylor's. You may want to see how you used it. That was in 1983.
Okay.
He talked about
So
there was
when
7 people.
when we're talking about the written language, and this is one of the things in introduction to my classes that I speak about, is that the person that developed this written language, his name is Dr. Alan Taylor out of the University of Colorado, and he developed dictionary. Start coming around the 1960s. He started coming around meeting with old Fred Gahn, old Steve Bradley, Rufus Warrior, and in the later years he started meeting with a lady by the name of Teresa Lanebo, and that became really his main informant as he worked towards developing a dictionary for the language. And I always look at some of these documents and as they speak about it, I don't know if they want to really make us sound really bad off. What year was this now? What year? 1983. Okay, how many speakers of the language they're saying?
7.
There's 7. No, there was a lot more in 1983. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of speakers of the language. But again, there's all those dynamics of it. How many of them wanted to be known as speakers of the language? Because at that time, it wasn't good to be considered Indian. The lighter skinned you were, the better you got treated. Okay, the further you were from being Indian or any aspect of Indian, the better off you were. That's why parents didn't teach the language to their kids. They said you gotta learn, you gotta go to college. That's the way that you're gonna survive now. So they wouldn't teach them anything about their culture, about their history and their ways, because it wasn't good. And it wasn't good to be Indian. If you were Indian, you were also dirty. You were, it was just a negativity attached to that. around this time, you know, this is back in the time my late grandfather, who I'm named after, this is my mother's father, he kept a lot of our ceremonies and songs going, but he did it in secret. There's probably about a handful of them. They'd all gather up together and they'd conduct these ceremonies, just a handful of them, because they were used to that time period that if they were caught by the Indian agent, they would be penalized. Rations would be withheld. They wouldn't be eligible for any type of assistance or help. I mean, that was their reality. But I'm so glad that they did it in secret, in hiding, that they had their teachings passed on about the pipe, that they had their sweat lodge ceremonies passed on, the songs, family songs, all those things, you know, passed on. You know, that now we're able to, you know, continue those things. But we look at newspaper articles such as this saying that we only have, you know, 7 speakers left. That's inaccurate. Now you look, now that's probably more accurate now in 2018. Okay, but 1983, oh my goodness, if that were, we were back in 1983 now. Wow. You know, we could, you know, in hindsight, they say, you know, a lot clearer. So this is, as we try to reconstruct our language, you know, so it's you know, looking at the article, and Mr. Taylor believes Rowant is probably destined for extinction. Thanks a lot, Dr. Taylor. But, you know, it's grim, you know, forecast and outlook, you know, is one of those things, you know, like when we talk about how we're going to preserve our language, it takes a shift in consciousness and the way that we think that's going to preserve our language. Less of an emphasis on video games and cell phones, more of an emphasis on family time, on speaking with one another, not through text, not through Snapchat, not through Facebook, speaking face to face. How are we going to, you know, say less of an emphasis on basketball? Let's focus on our traditional games. Let's put an emphasis on that. Less of an emphasis on the country music and the hip hop music, and more of our traditional forms of music. Less of an emphasis on the hip hop dance and the 2-step and the line dancing. No, let's focus on our traditional forms of dancing. How do we do that? Well, that's the question right there. How do we go about that? You know, and it's real simple answers, but when you actually get to doing it in your own family, then you start to see a whole different set of dynamics. How do you go to the next one, or do you want to continue on?
Say a little more, then I'll go on to this. I'll go on to the next one. If you,
oh, okay.
Here's,
She's kicking me off of here.
Let's see. Okay. Okay. So I just wanted to look at what Tachini Pete has said. He pointed out that to have a plan, and that's what John was talking about, is to we need some kind of a plan. And he's talking about the shift of consciousness, about getting away from the games and the challenges that every family is. After this historic trauma, the challenge of bringing the family back together to begin to share the stories, to do the family trees and see the richness of each of our families from the maternal and the paternal backgrounds. And Tachini Pete pointed out that it takes 2,200 hours to become proficient in Indigenous language. But the way public schools are going right now, if they continue to teach 20 minutes to a half an hour, it's going to take the children about 55 years to become proficient. So what John was talking about was the family time of listening, the family time of reinforcing that with the community classes that he teaches can help the parents come in and reinforce what some of the young people are learning in school. And so we have a challenge, but I feel the real critical part for each of us is to have, is to make certain that we have a plan, because there is just so many areas to start on. I just wanted to point out that the late Daryl Kipp stated that we should never be ashamed to speak the language. You know, we might make mistakes and stuff, but just to keep trying. And he also felt, and this just really, really hits home with me, is that Indigenous language should not be politicized. So many times we have people who have little bits of information, and rather than sharing, they hoard the information because they think, oh my gosh, somebody else will come to specialists. So I really feel that his statement about the language should not be politicized is really, really important. And then there's different ways of reinforcing the language. And a real challenge for me was this past year. I did this piece on spirit writing. I was asked to, people call it poetry, but I did this with a piece that I had written when I was very ill. And I went up and did this in public and I did my okay, I did this in public in our language, and it was really challenging, but I really internalized the words. And so getting out and challenging, I would like to put together here in our community a little group of people where our young people in the group can come together and together maybe have a fashion show of our ribbon skirts to introduce people in their language, and then to say a little bit in our spirit writing in our language. I just think it would be so rich. So there's lots of different ways that fun ways, and I know John does lots of real richness with using the language in terms of the stick games. In order for the kids to have to play stick games, they have to do that. They have to learn the numbers in our language. He does this with bingo. And so I just wanted to end by telling you that, you know, our older ones tell us when you take someone's time, you get part of their lives. So I just want to say, give me hand to each of you for providing part of your life to this really, really critical part of language revitalization. So, stop there. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Let's see, let's look at the chat. Lori asked, John, are you a class 7 teacher?
Yeah.
Yes.
How can I talk?
Yeah, you can talk right now.
Lenore, what was the number of hours you said that they said it takes to learn an Indigenous language?
2,200 to become proficient in it.
Wow. Yeah, it's not adequate at all. But then when John shares that he teaches kindergarten through 12th grade and can't even fit in 5th grade, you know, we need more teachers for sure, but the students definitely need to have more time with the language. It seems so minimal. And John, the only other teacher that I know that teaches K through 12 of her language is Michelle Moccasin at Lodgegrass. And she, you know, I know how she runs from, you know, building to building, and how crazy it is to go from 12th grade to kindergarten, and how she has no materials and no real support. And it sounds like you have a lot of those same challenges as well.
Lori asked, what are the events around which we can learn about worldviews?
want me to give a little bit more clarification about that?
Sure. Take it away, Laurie.
The question is, well, I'm thinking about the ways that our worldview affects the things that we say and how we say them. And so I'm trying to think of a couple of different areas, I guess, if we were going to do language development, like our interactions with the physical world, maybe one place that culture kind of plays a part in what we can say, or our interaction with the spiritual world, or our interactions in family circles. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of anything that's been done to sort of collect these kind of events around which it seems language differs on a cultural plane.
And may I respond? This is Lenore, and I did when I was teaching at the University of Saskatchewan, I developed a graduate course called Indigenous pedagogy. And so all of the Native students who were in my graduate course were going around. We started the class with a circle. That was another thing, you know, I didn't put people in lines. I made them sit in a circle, and we would go around the room and everybody would express themselves. So every student complained. They said, oh, we're the most researched group of people. Everybody writes about us. You know, we feel so objectified. And so at the end, I told them, I said, okay, I said, this is an Indigenous pedagogy course. Pedagogy is how we teach about what we know. And so the term paper this year, we're going to put together a set of articles that each of you are going to write about from your nation about how you teach about what you know. So we did this book, and my gosh, it was sold out immediately, and people absolutely loved it, and it was amazing. One lady did one on parenting styles from residential school versus Indigenous parenting styles. Mm-hmm. Another one did the use of the medicine wheel and the circle of life. We had other people talk about the Cree language. I mean, it was just really a rich experience. I did my spirit writing. We had a neuroscientist who even came in. She was from the Gordon's Reserve, and she was a research scientist at the University of Saskatchewan. And she did one on clashing worldviews within the sciences. So it was really, really rich. I mean, there is so much out there, and that's why I love being a Native. I love to kind of go observe how we do things versus how others, for example, even how we learn, even here, we're told, like John pointed out, we don't take shortcuts in our ceremonies. And, and if everything is oral, and sometimes, we go and we'll go to a sweat lodge, for example, and people say, well, I have class or I'm going to be busy. But in the sweat lodge, you don't take shortcuts. You start, and when you finish, you finish. A different sequence of time, a different sequence of context, a different sequence of who can speak and who listens, a different context of structure of family. And I always emphasize the really, really critical part that women play as life givers, and being able to nurture and help. That's the greatest honor we can have, is to be able to, that the Hathic, our creator, would allow us to be a life giver. I mean, what more of a miracle can we have than that? And to make sure that we honor that and take good care of these children that our creator has placed in our care. So, I mean, there is just so much that we can talk about. And so that's good. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Great. Hope that's it.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. This was fun. We didn't exactly follow, but it turned out even richer than I thought. Thank you, Casey, for being here.
Yep, it was really good.
Great.
All right, so
Thank you, Lenore.
Thank you very much. Is that Ione?
Yeah.
Congratulations. I hear you got honored at MIA.
Yeah.
The work you do. That's wonderful.